Hi, it's Kai, and this is Un-American. In Un-American, I invite international experts to share their perspectives on US-related issues and to add new angles to inherently American debates. Today, I'm talking with Israeli peace activist Noy Katsman about Israel's ever-expanding war in the Middle East and the shortcomings of the American debate on the conflict. Noy Katsman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So actually the first question that I would really like to ask you after preparing this interview is, where do we start? Because I feel like the moment you decide to talk about Palestine and Israel and the broader region itself is really the moment that you feel the complexity of the conflict and its history really weighing down on you. There are little moments, though, in which I feel that the opposite is really true, that there's, in fact, something very simple at the heart of this conflict, and that unconsciously suppressing or willfully omitting this simple truth is the actual disservice to a meaningful discussion. Luckily, that simple truth has been, as I was relieved to find, already written down by someone, and that someone is Rashid Khalidi in his book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. In the book's conclusion, he boils down the state of affairs in the region to the following observation. There are now two peoples in Palestine, irrespective of how they came into being, and the conflict between them cannot be resolved as long as the national existence of each is denied by the other. Their mutual acceptance can only be based on complete equality of rights, including national rights, notwithstanding the crucial historical differences between the two. There is no other possible sustainable solution, barring the unthinkable notion of one people's extermination or expulsion by the other. Do you find this simple logic of extermination or expulsion on the one hand and equal rights on the other hand convincing or too reductive?
I think there's always a question, what is sustainable for how long? But yes, I do agree. I think to start the healing, we need the rights. But I think we also need understanding and conciliation, understanding other people's narratives. But that can come out of having the same rights. So, of course, exactly like I want basic equality and security for everyone, for my people, I want it also for Palestinians. There's no question of that even for me. So I think this is the part of the answer, because I don't see the people living in Gaza as people different than me. I think as movements, as people, we should try to be more practical and less dogmatic and essentializing. For example, if we start to think, okay, who needs to go back? Who needs to go back to their land? So you're saying, okay, everyone needs to go back to their land. Okay, so what about the Tunisian Jews? What about the Moroccan Jews? What about all of these Jews? Do they also need to go back to their land? This is what you want to do, return everyone to there, and then where they return where they were before, and then where they were before. This sounds to me like a dogmatic approach that doesn't bring us somewhere, because it says, oh, someone has only one home, only one place, and they need to go there. There's no way everyone will be happy. Even though I'm very sad and I do want justice to people who were expelled from their homes, I think we can find solutions that won't bring more displacement. In my opinion, we should bring less displacement now and not more. I took many courses in nonviolence communication. And one of the things they said there is sometimes it's a lot more important for us to get the empathy and the understanding than to get something specific. Sometimes we just need the thing behind what the thing represents for us. But I think Israelis don't understand that they need to give up their privileges for this. Israelis don't understand their privilege. They don't understand the discrimination that other people feel. They don't understand that by discriminating other people, they get a wealthier life or a better life. I think Israelis need to understand that.
If we ascribe to Rashid Khalidi's logic that there are only two ways forward in this conflict, either complete equality of rights for Palestinians and Israelis or extermination or expulsion of one people, then I think we can safely say that right now, in the big scheme of things, we have moved away from the equality of rights end of the spectrum and that we're edging closer to the logic of extermination. Surely the Hamas attack on October 7th, 2023, that killed 1,400 people is an expression of that. Surely the fact that since then more than 41,000 people have been killed as a result of Israel's retaliation in Gaza, more than 700 people in the West Bank, and now more than 2,000 people in Lebanon is an expression of that. But many observers saw this bloodshed coming more than a year ago. For example, journalist David Klion, who only 4 days after the Hamas incursion wrote that many Palestinians in Gaza, quote, are already dead no matter what any of us feel, think, or say. Did you have a similar feeling of impending doom in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas attack? Or was there some hope in you that Israel might choose a different path?
That's a great question. So it's not the first time that there was attack from Gaza or from Palestinians. And there's some logic in Israel that it's like an equation that if one Israeli is dead, at least 10 Palestinians need to die as well. So I thought it would be exactly the same. So for me and for other people like me, it was obvious. It's not like it was totally surprise for me. I understand it's always a war zone. I think for many Israelis, maybe it was because they believe that they're living in the safe heaven. Also, I think now it's more obvious that the war has no goals. I read plus 972 in Hebrew version. I don't know if this article is posted in English. I think it was. An article by Oren Yiftachel, a professor actually from my university in Beersheba. And he wrote, this is the first apartheid war of Israel. And that it means that this war has no goal. It doesn't have a goal to conquer a land. It doesn't have a goal to change the political thing. The opposite. Its goal is to keep the regime between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And I really agree with that. At the beginning, I think Israel was saying this narrative, oh, we're going to destroy Hamas. And I think it was very clear from the beginning that it won't work. I think that history shows us that all of the modern wars between the modern army and the terror organization didn't end well for the empire. And of course, not for the people. But even if it would have been, there's two things here. This lie that is supposed to justify a war on one hand, but also even if this was a way to make Hamas extinct, I don't think it's worth the death of so many people.
So one of the people killed in the Hamas attack was your brother Noy Katsman, who worked as a peace activist in a kibbutz around a mile from Gaza, and who committed much of his life to actually diffusing tensions between Jewish settlers and Palestinian farming communities. He was shot by Hamas, shielding his neighbor from incoming bullets. But only weeks after his death, you wrote an article that said, quote, I'm calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, and I'm calling upon the Israeli government to pursue a path to freedom and safety for everyone. What inspired you to write those lines, and what inspired you to also repeat that demand in interviews with CNN and other news channels?
So as a leftist in Israel, Palestine, you need to have a lot of empathy. All of my life, I needed to have empathy to terrorists on one hand, also for soldiers committing war crimes on the other hand. It's a lot of lessons in empathy, which is difficult. It's a lot more easy, I think, to radicalize and become empathetic only for one side. Also, people need to understand that as a leftist, we're so marginalized, you never get a microphone. And then I got a microphone and they're like, wow, it's or now or never that really people can listen to me, what my message is. Never actually happens. That's why I got interviewed when I got the chance. Yes, and that's what I said. I called for my government to stop the bloodshed, to stop the revenge, that it doesn't bring safety, all the things I said. So I think as a person who wants to see a different future, this is our responsibility to create political imagination. I think this is the thing that we in Israel, we lack the most, political imagination. Imagination that something else can happen. We need more people who can imagine a different life, because it's very easy to look at the reality and say, oh, these constructions are real. They're really Palestinians and Israelis, and it's like that, and they have different interests. But we need to imagine something else. Always Israelis tell you, oh, you're talking about these Palestinians. Let's see how you will talk when they kill you or your family. But that's the complexity. And this is what people can understand. If people see that my brother was killed by Hamas, and also I'm active in an Israeli-Palestinian movement, and also I can fight for peace, this is what really shows the reality. Because I live inside these complexities. So after the 7th of October, I was really angry. I saw my society, the Israeli society, as responsible for not doing anything. I wanted to go to the Israelis and tell them, what you want is people to think that Israelis are good people. That's what I did. But they don't like me because they try to convince them by racism and by explaining to them how the other side is bad. But also explaining that your side is good, that you are you can be moral, and you can understand the other people. This is what many people are looking for. And it reminds me that right after the 7th of October, when I requested from the government not to do revenge, I got many comments. One of them was a girl in Gaza, a teenager in Gaza wrote to me, I can't believe there are Israelis who don't want to kill all of us. And another person wrote to me, wow, after watching your interview, I understood that there are good Israelis and not all of the Israelis are bad.
I find that a really beautiful way of looking at it, I have to say, to talk about political imagination in this respect. In a sense, I feel like with the op-ed, in my eyes, you did something like that. You did something that the Netanyahu government failed to do in that moment, because you found the strength to pursue peace instead of revenge. Even though in that moment, I think most people would have probably understood if you chose revenge, to be honest. Now I can hear people saying, well, maybe it's naive to assume that politicians and government officials have the same freedom in responding to a crisis as individuals do. I think that the opposite is more true to me, though, that the further removed you are from the incident itself, the more freedom you should likely have in weighing your options. And it's then equally sensible to point out that there existed, in fact, many Israeli leaders in the past who chose to do what you did. And this is something that was, in my opinion, very beautifully pointed out by Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek in a speech at the Frankfurt Book Fair last year, shortly after the Hamas attack, actually. In his speech, Slavoj Žižek noted that in the past there were many Israeli politicians who knew that nothing could be gained for Israel by fighting fire with fire. And to underline this point, Žižek cited a eulogy given by Israeli military leader and politician Moshe Dayan, who, in response to an Israeli soldier being killed and mutilated by Palestinian attackers in 1956, said the following.
Let us not cast blame on the murderers today. What claim do we have against their mortal hatred of us? They have lived in the refugee camps of Gaza for the past 8 years, while right before their eyes, we have transformed the land and villages where they and their ancestors once lived into our own inheritance. End of quote. Can you even imagine a similar honest statement today? How far are we from the situation, even a complex of decades ago, when we were talking about land for peace agreement, two-state solution, or when even today's staunchest supporters of Israel were putting pressure on it not to build settlements in the West Bank?
So I would like to slightly adapt Žižek's question and turn it over to you. What goes through your mind when you hear that Moshe Dayan quote and then compare it to the rhetoric employed by the new generation of Israeli leadership around Benjamin Netanyahu and ministers like Itamar Ben-Gvir?
I would say that Benjamin Netanyahu did a lot in his years to narrow the political imagination to only one option, which is the option that he showed. And he was proud of this option for a long time. He always was bragging about it. He was even bragging about supporting Hamas. It was Israel's strategy. It was a political strategy to support Hamas so that Hamas and the Palestinian Authority won't go together and demand an Israeli state. And they would say this kind of work, the liberal left or the liberal people in Israel got used to this, and they got used to their privileges, and they didn't care about the political implications or they didn't mind anymore. When you're privileged and you have everything nice, it's easy to forget that this is an impossible situation for someone else. So Bibi was very proud of himself, of maintaining this structure, this very narrow political option. And I think it was comfy for the Israelis. So that's why they continued doing that and continued choosing him. And sadly, there wasn't anyone from the Israeli leaders who could challenge it. So look at the last leader of the Communist Party, Ayman Odeh. Very impressive person, very pragmatic person, a lawyer from Haifa, a very nice figure, in my opinion. And he's in the Israeli mainstream, he's seen as someone radical left, which is really weird for me. But this is exactly whoever dares to bring a different political imagination, of a different political option is automatically shown as a traitor. So I think Bibi did a lot of it, but I don't want to blame only the leader because I feel it's sometimes too easy. Many Israelis like to say, oh, we are okay, we don't agree with Bibi. But I don't know. Is Gantz better? Gantz is the person who his advertisement for the elections was a video counting down all of the Palestinians he killed when he was the head of the IDF.
So what you're saying in a way is that the shift that we've seen in Israeli politics is a shift that you have seen taken place for many, many years in Israeli society, a radicalization or a hardening of positions, let's say.
Yes, exactly. I think many of the people who talk against Bibi, sadly, they don't talk against him for the right reasons, in my opinion. In my opinion, as I explained why I don't like Bibi, because of his destruction of the political imagination of Israelis. That's why I don't agree. And his horrific strategy, which exploded in the 7th of October. But the reason other people talk against Benjamin Netanyahu, it's not that they really oppose his political views. They are just don't want to lose their power. They're afraid that the right wings or that the settlers will take over their political powers. So I think this is something very important for people to understand. When people say we're against Bibi, it doesn't mean we pro-Palestinian. It doesn't mean they're against the genocide in Gaza. It doesn't mean they're against settlers in the West Bank. No, it just means they are probably a little afraid of losing their power. So in my opinion, it was seeds that were already before. There's this colonial logic that Israelis need to have better lives than Palestinians, that Israelis always need to be safe, that we have the right in the land, that Palestinians should just not bother and should say thank you that we give them anything. This is the logic that many Israelis believe in. So this colonial logic said, okay, we need to be the safest. And the people who lived here before, the natives, the indigenous, however you would call it, we need to hold them. We need to make sure they won't do to us anything because they are angry at us. Exactly what Moshe Dayan said. This is exactly the thinking. And no one challenged it, as I said. No one challenged this logic. The most challenging of logic was saying, oh, not all the Palestinians are terrorists. We should be nice to them. This isn't challenging the logic. This isn't challenging the power relations in the ground. So we had this logic for many years, and everyone was comfortable with it, at least all of the Israelis, except for me maybe, or other people. But then, when we got this huge crisis of 7th of October, so I know exactly this logic will be activated and used. So then we see all of these people who say, we are sober, we are sober now. We always thought that the Palestinians, we believed in peace, but now we don't believe anymore in peace. Now, people feel a lot more free to say what they thought or what they thought a little bit, but now everyone's saying it. They feel more freedom to say more racist things. So I think that's how it shifted. It did become a lot worse because people feel a lot more comfortable to say racist things. People feel a lot more comfortable to war crimes. This isn't something that happens from a very liberal and a democratic state or whatever. No, it's a process that happened for many years.
Now, we just talked about what's happening inside of Israel and in the debate inside of Israel. Your family is still in Israel. You used to live in Beersheba. You are now in Berlin in Germany. And your family actually emigrated to Israel from the United States. So you're also seeing debates elsewhere, I believe, just as I'm seeing debates elsewhere. I'm following the debate in Germany. I'm currently living in the US and I'm following the debate there. Against this background, I'm very interested to find out whether in following these debates, are we both seeing and hearing the same things? And let me try to synthesize what I observe in that respect and what I've observed over the past months. Firstly, I think I've observed that in the US debate and also in the European debate, specifically in the German debate, there's this pathological, I would say, inability or a racist refusal to really distinguish between Hamas and millions of Palestinians. Secondly, I've observed that there's in many mainstream media debates almost unconditional support for Israeli retaliation, no matter how violent it may get, either through openly supporting the Netanyahu government or through really a lack of condemnation of his government. And thirdly, what I'm observing is really an utter lack of nuance in acknowledging that this phrase that's often used by commentators, standing by the side of Israel, can have two very different meanings. One can be that you're standing by the side of a diverse Israeli society and people like you that find itself plunged into a conflict again. And the other meaning can be that you're standing by a right-wing regime that is growing ever more outspoken about the fact that it has no interest in ending this bloodshed. Do you share some of these observations? Do you find that there's some truth in these observations when you look at reporting in the US, for example?
Yeah, so I would start by saying that one thing I do notice a lot is, I would say, humanizing Israelis a lot more than Palestinians. This is the main thing I feel as myself, as someone who, my brother was killed. Every time there is something about the hostage, I see it in the headlines of the New York Times or whatever, the Guardian. But like daily kills of Palestinians isn't reported so much, and it happens every day. And this is very difficult for me. And I feel I get a lot of attention. My brother was killed. I get a lot of interviews. I am thankful for it, of course. But on the other hand, I'm like, okay, but people are dying every day. Like, it's crazy. And no one's stopping it. And like this, and no one, like, they don't report about it. And like, they give so much attention to the death of Israelis and so little attention to Palestinians. I don't think it needs to go one on the thing of the other, but this lack of attention to the death of Palestinians enables this continuation. Now, I think even the Israeli IDF says, yes, we're doing now annexation of North Gaza. Like, they're saying it. No one cares because no one cares about non-Western people. It's just definitely true. We think we are so progressive and whatever, but we see that no one cares about non-Western people. It's crazy. Also, about the thing of standing by Israel. Yes, what does it mean to stand by Israel? Because if you say you stand by Israel, but the Israelis prefer to kill Palestinians instead of bringing the hostages back, what is standing by Israel? Kamala Harris says, I'm standing by Israel. Biden says we're standing by Israel. Okay, hostages are dying. You say you're different from Hamas, which is pro-death. Okay, you claim that, but practically it's a lie. It's a lie because you don't want to bring back the hostages. You aren't willing to stop the war to bring back the hostages. You have this colonial imagination of what you're going to do from Gaza. So you're not standing by Israel. You're standing by this colonial idea of annexation of Gaza. Like you stood before, by the way. You said you're standing by Israel, but you didn't do anything on the settlements of the West Bank. So what exactly are you standing for when you say you're standing by Israel? I feel it's a cynical political use of Israel. And the Israelis, the actual Israelis who are suffering in the land, and the US is supposed to be the responsible grown-up, but they're just letting this crazy government just do whatever they want. So I don't really understand what it means standing the side of Israel. I think US will wake up in a few months and understand that they are just already now, but I don't know when they're going to wake up, maybe after the elections, and understand that they're just supporting government. It has become very fascist, has a lot of fascist things in it.
No, you said something very interesting just then in your answer, and that was that you feel that Western commentators, Western society is very comfortable and maybe also still hasn't fully understood the situation on the ground. And I feel like that is one explanation for what's going on in the US debate, in the European debate, that there's a certain unawareness still among many of us, and especially in the US public, when it comes to really understanding the reality in Israel and Palestine. And where I do think there's probably also some very deeply held political convictions that also explain it, I do want to steelman this ignorance argument for a second. Because in preparation for this podcast, I listened to a conversation between Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates, two journalists who I greatly admire and who have both recently traveled to the West Bank for the first time. In that podcast, you could basically hear them grapple with what they've seen in terms of segregation, discrimination, and violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. And Ta-Nehisi Coates describes the impact of that trip to the West Bank very vividly.
I felt lied to. I felt lied to by my craft. I felt lied to by major media organizations. And by media organization, I mean like producers of books, films, etc. Like the whole corpus of storytelling, which is what this book is obsessed with. I wanted to know how that happened. I wanted to know why there was so much difference between what you saw and what I saw and what I felt like I understood back here in America and what most people I knew understood back here in America.
Now, the question that came out of that for me is, if two of the smartest and most well-versed American journalists that I know are shocked to discover what they thought they knew about the lives of Palestinians does not at all resemble reality, then how far removed from the reality must the general American public be? Do you think that many people in the US, even people with an interest in politics and the region, really understand what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank and how Israel is operating there?
I think it's obvious that people who live in a different country won't understand what's happening in this country, no matter how much they listen or read. And also, if they come to visit for 10 days, I don't think they will understand. But in the same way, also an Israeli who lives all their life and sees only Israeli media won't understand exactly what's happening. And obviously, on the other hand, I think that Israel-Palestine is used as one of these world geopolitics binaries that is used to position yourself somewhere. I can say Russia-Ukraine, trans-anti-trans, Israel-Palestine. Maybe there are a few more, but these are the dominant binaries I can think about that people use to say where they are, to position themselves in some way. And of course, they have connections between them. So it's a way to position yourself more than care really about what's happening in the land. And this is why I think that it's our responsibility, people on the ground, Israelis and Palestinians, to change and to criticize our own societies to make this reality change. But that's why we need mediators. That's the importance of mediators. Mediators is people like me. Mediators is people like many Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians on one side and Palestinians on the other side, and they live in an Israeli state. It can be Palestinians maybe in the diaspora, because I feel that they can be the mediation between the West and the Palestinian state. That's why I'm also living with my Palestinian friend, because I think we need more stories like this, but she's a pragmatic person, exactly like me. Both of us are very pragmatic. That's why we get along together. So if people see this pragmatism and see people living between all of these structures, inside of them and outside of them, and not in these binaries, I think these are the representations the world needs to understand better what's happening. And all of these complexities of queer identity and Palestinian identity and Israeli identity, all of these things go together. And I think these are the representations that we really need as a world.
I do want to get into the political debate that you've just briefly mentioned before. I want to get into US policy for a second and the course that the US government has taken in all of this. And that policy or that course has been pretty disappointing over the last 12 months, to say the least. Biden administration has failed or really never actively wanted to put sufficient pressure on Netanyahu in order to facilitate a ceasefire. It is continuing to supply weapons to Israel. And it has, as ProPublica just reported actually, lied to Congress about the fact that Israel has committed war crimes by blocking US food and medicine shipments to Gaza. How do you view the role of the US government in the conflict up to this point?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because I remember at the beginning of the war, there was a thing of, US won't allow Israel to go into Rafah, right? That was the narrative. And I think also in the Israeli public, there's this narrative. It's a liberal narrative, like US is Western, it's good, it's going to help us not do bad things, it's going to help us not let the right wing take over. This is the narrative. And this is another place where I think the decolonial discourse is finding itself right, sadly. I'm saying sadly because I would have wanted to believe, yes, at the Western we have good values, that we want to have an order that supports human rights. I would have wanted to believe that. But it does seem the liberal order is only good for the Western people. It seems that the moment that there are people who are not Western involved in this, no one cares about the human rights anymore. And this is a huge proof for that. So I think a lot of Israelis also thought so. They thought this. They thought, if we do something really bad, so US won't let us. But as the war becomes more and more bad and nothing is happening, so we understand we can't trust the US. We can only trust ourselves, Israelis and Palestinians. We have only ourselves, and we can't trust the US.
To underline that point that you just made, because criticism like the criticism that we just leveled at the US administration and against US politics in general has been met very stoically. For example, the Harris campaign, who has not indicated a serious deviation from Biden's policies on the issue, which it could have done. Or the Democratic National Convention, which didn't even manage to include a Palestinian speaker, even though that seemed like the lowest and least controversial form of some inclusivity, I would say. And even many of the usually outspoken progressives inside the Democratic Party are really walking on eggshells, in my opinion, so as not to ruin their political future, especially in the run-up to the election. I could also talk about the horrific stance of the Republican Party, of course, here. But I think that would be futile given that there's people like Lindsey Graham in the Republican Party who are of the opinion that Israel should just, quote, do whatever it has to in Gaza. Now, I think it's safe to assume that much of this political behavior is calculated and that it has on the Democratic side at least partially to do with a fear of backlash from donors in the run-up of the election. And partly, of course, with an actual support for Israel's cause within the party. There might also be another explanation, though, another reason for the futile attempts of the Biden administration to stop the conflict from spiraling out of control. And that reason has been outlined by Ezra Klein recently, namely a failure of the US government in recognizing who they are dealing with on the Israeli side.
One thing I've said to a lot of people who are mad at college protesters over the past year is that the college protesters, in many ways, understand modern Israel better than the 70-year-old American or 80-year-old American politicians, because the only Israel they ever knew is Netanyahu's Israel. Whereas I think there are a lot of people in American politics still trying to negotiate with the Israel of 18 years ago.
Given this context, do you feel that maybe US politics has still not truly understood the true colors of Netanyahu's government?
Yeah, definitely. I think US, part of it is they don't want to give up their allegedly alliance in the Middle East. But I think it doesn't understand Israel's changed. It doesn't understand that people are getting right-wing, and they don't understand the disaster. That's one thing. The second thing can say, okay, US never cared about any human rights, any liberal values. They only cared about their gas. They only cared that they're going to have interest in the Middle East. They didn't care about the Jews also. It's just a way to get power. I don't think one of them is completely right. I think human discourse is complex and it has many voices in it. Western liberal values maybe do exist to some extent, probably do, just not so perfect as people imagine them. There's always negotiation also on these interests and also about these values. I think US is in a pretty difficult situation, the US government, because on the one hand, they really don't like the right-wing government, obviously. But on the other hand, they feel that it's very politically delicate to stop arming Israel. If I just look at it as a political question, without any lives inside, human lives in it, I can understand politically the catch they are stuck in. But Americans are supposed to be good in storytelling. I want to believe that if they wouldn't have had so much energy in the elections now, they would have found a way to frame them supporting the Israelis themselves and not the government, as I think Biden did when trying to support the hostages' families. On the other hand, I think there's a big problem with the Israelis themselves. You can't say you support something if you don't find Israelis who agree with you. I think this is the main problem. Okay, they're standing together. There's a few organizations maybe that agree with you and go in this narrative. But many Israelis just want to continue killing Palestinians. They don't care. And they don't care enough about the hostages to stop that. I think if in Israel itself, there would be a lot more people who agree with you, it would be a lot easier because the US government could say, okay, I support them. But if there's no voices that challenge Israeli government inside Israel, I understand it's a very difficult challenge for the US, yes.
Against that background, what do you think about the Kamala Harris and Tim Walz campaign pretty much continuing the politics of the Biden administration and not finding their own more proactive idea or political cause on Israel-Palestine?
I think it will bring a big backlash. Kamala Harris is always saying she's for Israel, blah, blah, blah. But she's ignoring these Palestinian families or Palestinian people in the US who see that their families are just getting slaughtered. So how can she expect to get their support when she's saying, I'm standing by Israel? I really understand her frustration. I also hate Donald Trump, but I don't understand how she cannot give Palestinian people anything. Like it seems like she's not giving them anything. So can she expect that they will vote for her in November? Like I wouldn't If I would have been a Palestinian, I would have never voted for Kamala Harris because I couldn't have done it. Because if my family and all of my relatives are in danger and she's not doing anything for it, and she's just saying I'm standing by Israel, so how can she expect their support?
As with any other interview, really, I'd like to end on a positive note. I have to admit, though, that I had a very hard time in thinking about what that might be this time around, because asking a question like, what does peace in the Middle East look like to you, pretty much seems like asking you, what does Mars look like, or something like that. However, I still want to stick with that question, kind of, just in a slightly different way. What are the most memorable moments of peace, maybe even just minutes of peace or hours of peace that you have experienced in Israel, in your work, and in your everyday life between Israelis and Palestinians? And what do you take away from them?
One pretty memorable thing for me was after settlers did a pogrom in Hawara, which is a village in the West Bank, there was a protest of the judicial reform. And these protests of the judicial reform, me and my friends on the left would always criticize them heavily for being only against Bibi. But then when the cops came, the Israelis in the protests screamed, "Eifa haytem b'Chavara? Where were you in Chavara? Like, where were you when this pogrom happened in the village?" And no soldier came to stop it. No soldier came to stop the settler violence. So I think that was a moment for me that I was like, wow, actually, these apolitical people, when it comes to the Palestinian, they do have a red line. Another thing, I always see very nice initiatives between Israelis and Palestinians. And all of these people, like Ma'oz Inon, and there is a podcast that I really like called The Third Narrative by Amira and Ibrahim, Palestinian citizens of Israel, who aren't afraid also to give empathy to Israelis, also to criticize their own society. This is exactly the people we need to go forward and to continue. I think before the 7th of October, people did feel that they wanted to connect to Palestinians and to Israelis. And I hope after some time passes from the 7th of October, people can go back to that and remember that they want to live in peace and that we are people in this land and we deserve to live together peacefully. I believe that they understand that they can have better life and they deserve more.
What are your personal strategies for staying hopeful?
I think the most important is to surround yourself with a community of people who think the same way as you or have the same values as you. In Israel, I had Standing Together, and I also had my peer community, which is mostly left, I would say. And of course, my Palestinian friends. This gives me hope, because if I have people who think like me and they grew up in a different culture from me and we can work together, this is what brings the most hope for me. And as I said, more political imagination. And this is part of the success of the Israeli regime, separating the people, separating the languages, the segregation. We need to oppose that, and opposing that is a political thing. Also, I think the situation in Israel-Palestine can change in ways we don't think about. Many of the changes in the world happen because of random things, and we can't think about and we can't imagine in the moment. But we need to be ready when these things happen to take them forward, to take them to the next level, and to make a better future.
Noy Katsman, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.